You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly MEMO podcast. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Peter Beinart to discuss his new book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. Peter, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I don't think you need much by way of introduction. Peter is a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York, author of several books. But I wanted to really discuss his current book. At the guilty of stating the obvious, we are moving through a moment of huge significance politically and morally, I think. An indication of that is the profusion of books seeking to make sense of this moment. A number of authors, for example, Pankaj Mishra, he's published a book, The World After Gaza. Omar Al-Akkad, One Day Everyone Will Always Have Been Against This, which is a thought-for-a-moving book. And then there's your book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. So would it be accurate for me to say that this is motivated, again, by a recognition of the significance of this moment that we are passing through? And this is almost biblical in proportion.
Yes, I don't exactly know what it means to call it biblical in proportion, but I do think that this is a profound event, a profound horror. The destruction of this of Gaza and its basic institutions of life. Yes. And I listened to your book. I was listening and also read your book. To be honest, I listened to the podcast audio book. You come across as almost as a Cassandra figure within the Jewish community, warning of a looming moral crisis, yet dismissed or ostracized by some sections of the community. Would you say that the challenge the Jewish community facing is not really one of existential threat to Israel, but really an existential moral threat to the Jewish tradition, which Israel is undermining by its actions? Is this one of the drivers for why you're writing this book? It is. I mean, it's important to say that with Judaism, as with Christianity and Islam, these are vast and ancient traditions, so they speak in many voices. It's hard to pin them down to one essence. But I do think that one theme in Jewish tradition, religious tradition, is the idea that all human beings are created in the image of God. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, does not begin with the Jewish story with Abraham and then with Jacob. It begins with universal human beings, Adam and Eve and Noah, etc. And so it seems to me from this notion, we should take the idea that all human life is infinitely precious. And yet that's certainly not the way that Israel treats Palestinians, and especially not now during this destruction of Gaza. And so it seems to me something has gone wrong in Jewish discourse, organized Jewish discourse, when we prioritize the rights of the state with a particular political system, right? Where you always have to say Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state, right? Meaning a state that gives Jews superior legal rights. As I interpret Jewish tradition, you don't start with the rights of the state. You start with the rights of the human being. The human being is created in the image of God. And a state is just an instrument for the protection of human life and human flourishing. And if a state radically fails in that, any state, then the nature of that state should be reimagined so that it does a better job of protecting human life. And that is, I think, the discourse that I would like to offer in Jewish spaces, but it's quite different than the one that dominates today.
Yeah, and you have a line in your book where you describe the Jewish state as Israel as being almost a false idol. You can reject Jewish religion without being called a heretic, but if you reject Israel, somehow you're seen as being falling into some kind of heresy. So can you explain that? I mean,
yes.
I don't want to go into our Muslim tradition, but there is a discussion within the Muslim community about the idea of an Islamic state, that the problem is the state itself. The modern nation state is a problem. If you try and somehow try to fit an ancient tradition, a society and a community, religious community, within a modern nation state system, it inevitably leads to idiosyncrasies. So there is that discussion within the Muslim community, but it seems you are also suggesting that Israel has become something of a false idol for Jews as well.
Yes, I mean, if you look at the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the, you see that there's actually a great suspicion of the idea of states, or what would have been called in this time kingdoms, right? So, in the when the Israelites ask in the Hebrew Bible for God to give them a king, the prophet Samuel asks God about this, and God says, well, you should warn them that this king will oppress them. And then there are certain notions that try to restrain the power of the king, because the state, the kingdom, is recognized as being a potentially oppressive force. And I'm not against the existence of states. We live in a world of states. I don't think in this stage of history we can think outside of that capacity. But the point is that states are only of conditional value, not of unconditional value. They must be limited. And to what I mean by idolatry is that I think in many organized Jewish communities in the U.S. and beyond, the state is in a kind of object of worship, which is to say it has unconditional value. There's nothing that Israel could do that would lead Jewish leaders to say, well, at this point, I now oppose the state. So if it does A, I'll support it. But if it does B, that's too much. And now I want to, withhold military aid or impose sanctions. What ends up happening is that whatever Israel does, people come up with a justification for that. And that seems to me a kind of worship, a kind of idolatry of the state. As you say, it is very Judaism. In Judaism, there are many traditional commandments, understanding what you need to do, what you are commanded to do as a Jew. None of them suggest having an obligation to a state, right? They involve keeping the Sabbath, dietary laws, tending to the sick, feeding the poor, things, I'm sure many things that would also be in Islam and Christianity. And it's a very distorted understanding of what it means to be Jewish, to elevate the relationship to this state above all of those things.
And you've discussed that on a number of occasions, the idea of states having rights. Israelis insist on others recognizing that Israel has a right to exist. And that seems to be at odds with how as you think about states and others think about states. States gain legitimacy by protecting the rights of those people who are within its boundaries.
Yes.
But somehow Israel insists on being one of the few, well, I would say the only state which insists on having some kind of a right, a moral right to exist. So can you explain as to why you think that argument is flawed? Why states don't have a right to exist, but it's human beings that have a right to exist, and states, if they fail to uphold the rights of individual human beings, they lose that right. They lose the legitimacy.
Right. I mean, I think let's take the United Kingdom, right? The United Kingdom is the amalgamation of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, right? But if the people of Scotland vote and they decide they don't want to be part of the United Kingdom, or the people of Northern Ireland vote, right, then the United Kingdom has no right to exist as the United Kingdom of all of these populations, because its legitimacy should come from the consent of the governed. And there are very few people in the United States who would say that the United Kingdom has an absolute right to exist irrespective of the desires of the different populations under its control, right? And so that's the basic principle that I would apply here, right? Most of the Palestinians under Israeli control cannot vote. Those in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, they live under the control of a state that has life and death power over them, but they can't become citizens. They can't vote for the government of that state. And so that is a deeply undemocratic political system as it relates to Palestinians. And I think that this state should be reconstituted so it's based on the consent of the governed.
Let's turn to your book, and one of the key themes I notice is how you think the Jewish stories and the stories Jews tell about themselves is only half the picture, and you
describe many of the celebrations, like, for example, Purim, and you say one of the lines in your book is, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. That's basically how you summarize all the Jewish festivals. That's very, and you said, there's a very simplistic way of looking at that. Why is that? And why do you think this is only half the picture and we need to look at the other half of many of the celebrations within the Jewish tradition?
Right. My argument is that if you look at Jewish sacred texts, they depict Jews, and sometimes the word Jews might be an anachronism. We could say Israelites, but people that we consider ourselves bound to, that in a whole range of different ways, right? In the whole range of different human capacities, right? As victims, as also victimizers, right? So in the book of Esther, which Jews read on the holiday of Purim, which was just last week, it talks of an attempted genocide of the Jews if Persia by this figure we call Haman. But in the end, there's a power shift, and what ends up happening is a massacre by the Jewish leader Mordecai of Haman's followers, right? So, but what happens, I think, very frequently in Jewish discourse is that second element is erased. And so the story is considered to be just a story of Jewish victimhood and survival. And my point is that that template, that narrative, is really not true to our own tradition. And it helps people ignore things about Israel and Palestine as well, and take the events of Israel-Palestine and put them in that same framework, which is to say, this too is simply a story of the attempted destruction of the Jews, rather than understanding that although there obviously is been violence against Israeli Jews, violence that I think is, in the case of October 7th, immoral, especially because there was a lot of violence that targeted civilians, one has to understand that Israeli Jews are not simply in the role of victims of an anti-Semitic force, they're also part of a state that itself imposes tremendous amount of violence on Palestinians.
Yeah, I think just on a matter of observation, every human being can be a victim and an oppressor at the same time. That's just something theologically. Every religious text will say that we all have the capacity of inflicting immense harm and also being victims of immense suffering.
Exactly. No, that's part of what it means to recognize Jews as fully human, is that we have those capacities. And indeed, and there's nothing in history that says that just because a group of people was victimized in one moment of time, that means it can't become a victimizer at another moment of time. In fact, history is replete with examples in which exactly that happens.
And how does that play out politically? I mean, Israel is the regional superpower backed by the most powerful superpower in history in the US, but at the same time, it wants to maintain this narrative of victimhood, that there's always a Hitler that's going to rise up and kill us and destroy us, annihilate us. So how does that play out politically, do you think, and what is the dangers and implications of that?
Well, because I think it absolves Israel of moral responsibility, right? So, for instance, if people come along and say, listen, you're violating international law here, you're committing war crimes, as the International Criminal Court has said, because you are denying you're denying humanitarian aid to Gaza, and so people are literally starving, right? Or you are destroying the civilian infrastructure. The answer then becomes, well, this is anti-Semitism, right? So it gets put within this narrative of victimhood, right? There's nothing remotely anti-Semitic about the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court saying we're going to apply international law. We want to try to apply international law to Israel, just like we're trying to apply it to the Philippines and Russia and for that matter Hamas, right? But rather than wrestle with the question of whether Israel might have done something wrong, instead, it gets put within this framework of anti-Semitism, which is essentially that this is just the old story of Jews being victimized.
Another theme in your book is where you discuss the language of evasion, terms like transfer, security measures, which many would say obscures the reality of what happened to Palestinians since the Nakba and what has been happening ever since. So what role do these kind of euphemism play and are playing now as we are watching the horrors in Gaza?
I think that George Orwell famously argued that in order to justify kind of brutal acts, you need to come up with a euphemistic, sanitizing language so that people are not to obscure what's actually happening. And this happens all over the world. The United States does it, but you also see it vis-a-vis Israel, right? So you have a language, for instance, people often refer to Jewish self-determination in Israel, right? But one of the points I try to make in the book is that if we look carefully at that word self-determination, it starts with the word self, right? So self-determination means you have control over yourself. It doesn't mean you have control over others. I can't invoke my individual right to self-determination to tell you what to do. And Jews cannot invoke their collective right to self-determination to impose legal control, supremacy, mastery over Palestinians. And so this is one of many ways in which I think language is distorted to justify this system of oppression.
And another way, again, in your book, you discuss the way language and reality is distorted is through the weaponization of anti-Semitism. So maybe you can talk about that. And one of the observations I want to make on that is a lot of people have spoken about how the far right, including, you can say Trump, people like Orban, many others in the right in Europe, they are using anti-Semitism as a cudgel, as a way to demonize their political oppositions and opponents and crack down and create some kind of police state, almost an authoritarian state. And they're using anti-Semitism as a weapon to do that. What is the danger of that? So that's a separate question, but beginning with, how is anti-Semitism being weaponized, first of all, and then discuss the weaponization of that by the right wing.
Right. Well, so anti-Semitism is bigotry against Jews, right? And bigotry means that you treat people unequally, right? You treat them, you discriminate against them because of who they are, and you don't give them the same rights or opportunities as other people, right? So it's anti-Semitic to say that Jews should not be treated equally, including Israeli Jews. They should be treated equally. But it's not anti-Semitic to say that people should not have supremacy, right? It was not bigotry against white South Africans to say that white South Africans should have to live under the same law as black South Africans. It was not anti-Protestant bigotry to say that in Northern Ireland, Catholics should be treated equally with Protestants, right? This is a very perverse kind of language. So what ends up happening is you end up in the language of you call people bigots, you call them anti-Semites when they're actually fighting for the principle of equality, which is the opposite of bigotry, right? And that's the perversion that I think has been used in order to try to defend Israel and defend Israel's political system and Israel's actions against criticism.
And the second part, I guess, I think there's a development now I see, especially on social media. There's a fracturing within the right themselves. You see people who are really anti-Semitic, they're hostile to Jews, but they're using Israel as a way to say, we need America back from the from the hands of the Jews, and it's a very anti-Semitic way of saying things. So the intention is they may be pro-Palestinian in some sense, but the intention is very hostile. The intention, it comes from a bad, dark place. So I guess in the end, if people like Donald Trump and others play this game of using anti-Semitism, at the end of the day, it will come back to haunt Jews or harm Jews. Is that how you see it as well?
Yes, I do. People like Donald Trump or Viktor Orban are ethno-nationalists, right? They believe in the idea of a kind of tribal supremacy, that in any country, that one tribe should be in charge. In America, it would be white Christians. In Hungary, it would be white Christians. Narendra Modi believes this in India, that Hindus should be in charge, right? And everybody else is subordinate, right? And those ethno-nationalists tend to admire Israel because Israel is built on that system, right, of Jewish legal supremacy. It has an immigration policy that basically only allows Jews in and to get citizenship. And so they see Israel as a model. But the irony is that the Jews in their own country are very often opponents of that system of ethno-nationalism because Jews want to be treated equally under the law. American Jews don't want to live in a white Christian state, right? And so in a way, what happens is they end up being in conflict and often attacking and demonizing the Jews in their own country while admiring Israel. And this way in which you can be, this idea that you could be kind of anti-Semitic in your own country, but also very much favor Zionism, is a very old idea that Theodor Herzl himself, the founder of political Zionism, wrote famously that anti-Semites will be our best friends, because he understood that there were a lot of people in Europe who didn't want Jews in Europe, and they would be very happy if Jews had another place to go. And we still see this today, that there are many people who believe that Jews are great when Jews are in their country, meaning Israel, but Jews are not so great when they're in our country, meaning the United States or Hungary or France or wherever.
So, the key question now, I guess, is where does Jewish identity go from here? Zionism catapulted Israel at the center of Jewish life, but Jews have existed without Israel for 2 millenniums. For a lot of Jews now, looking at Gaza, how do they view Israel? Can Israel remain the center of Jewish life in perpetuity?
Well, many Jews, I would say most Jews around the world, still do have a very strong, feeling of solidarity and support for Israel. And indeed, I think the leadership has even what I would call a kind of relationship of worship to Israel. There is a smaller group, but not insignificant group, and I think you especially see it in the United States, especially among younger Jews, who are questioning that, who are saying, I believe in a Judaism that doesn't believe in the principle of legal supremacy, that believes in the idea of human equality. And so in the US, we see a struggle over that point of view. Now, in the Jewish community, I think the forces that are supporting Israel are going to be stronger for a long time. But it's important to remember that this struggle is not only taking place among Jews, it's a much broader struggle, right? So it seems to me if American policy is going to be change, it's going to be because there's a large movement that brings together people of all different backgrounds, right? Obviously with Palestinians at the center, but also including many Jews and Black Americans and other people, right? And so Jews can be part of that larger movement, even if they don't have most of the political power within the Jewish community. They can be part of a larger movement that I think could potentially change the Democratic Party and change U.S. policy towards Israel.
And this larger movement, this is the final question, I know you got to rush up, is a discussion about the one-state solution. You are two-stated before, now you are you support the one-state solution. Just discuss why you've made that transition. Just before we end, just give us your summary of that.
First of all, because I think one equal binational state is more just, in the sense that in partition, Palestinian citizens will still be second-class citizens in a Jewish state. They won't really be equal citizens. And also in a partition, as conventionally defined, Palestinian refugees can't return. And I just don't see how it's fair to say that Jews could return to the land of what we call the land of Israel after 2,000 years, but Palestinians who were expelled in 1948 or their children or grandchildren can't return. I also just don't think partition is possible anymore. I think that we now have Israel is simply too deeply entrenched in the West Bank, the heartland of a Palestinian state, to create a contiguous, viable, sovereign Palestinian state. So I think we should think beyond the idea of partition and think in a paradigm of equality.
Thank you, Peter. It was a pleasure hosting you today, and thank you for joining us. Do read Peter's new book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks. Take care.
Take care.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.